to myself. "Hark!" he said aloud. "Hark!" His tone galvanized me afresh. We stood listening, side by side. Far across the island, faintly sounding through the trees and brushwood, came a similar answering cry. Shrill, yet wonderfully musical, shaking the heart with a singular wild sweetness that defied description, we heard it rise and fall upon the night air. "It's across the lagoon!" Dr. Silence cried, but this time in full tones that paid no tribute to caution. "It's Joan! She's answering him!" Again the wonderful cry rose and fell, and that same instant the animal lowered its head, and, muzzle to earth, set off on a swift, easy canter that took it off into the mist and out of our sight like a thing of wind and vision. The doctor made a quick dash to the door of Sangre's tent, and following close at his heels, I peered in and caught a momentary glimpse of the small, shrunken body lying upon the branches, but half covered by the blankets. The cage from which most of the life, and not a little of the actual corporeal substance, had escaped into that other form of life and energy, the body of passion and desire. By another of those swift, incalculable processes which at this stage of my apprenticeship I failed often to grasp, Dr. Silence reclosed the circle about the tent and body. "Now it cannot return till I permit it," he said, and the next second was off at full speed into the woods with myself close behind him. I had already had some experience of my companion's ability to run swiftly through a dense wood, and I now had the further proof of his power almost to see in the dark. For once we left the open space about the tents, the trees seemed to absorb all the remaining vestiges of light, and I understood that special sensibility that is said to develop in the blind, the sense of obstacles. And twice as we ran we heard the sound of that dismal howling drawing nearer and nearer to the answering faint cry from the point of the island whither we were going. Then suddenly the trees fell away, and we emerged hot and breathless upon the rocky point where the granite slabs ran bare into the sea. It was like passing into the clearness of open day, and there, sharply defined against sea and sky, stood the figure of a human being. It was Joan. I at once saw that there was something about her appearance that was singular and unusual, but it was only when we had moved quite close that I recognized what caused it. For while the lips wore a smile that lit the whole face with a happiness I had never seen there before, the eyes themselves were fixed in a steady, sightless stare, as though they were lifeless and made of glass. I made an impulsive forward movement, but Dr. Silence instantly dragged me back. "No!" he cried. "Don't wake her!" "What do you mean?" I replied aloud, struggling in his grasp. "She's asleep. It's somnambulistic. The shock might injure her permanently." I turned and peered closely into his face. He was absolutely calm. I began to understand a little more, catching, I suppose, something of his strong thinking. "Walking in her sleep, you mean?" He nodded. "She's on her way to meet him. From the very beginning he must have drawn her, irresistibly." "But the torn tent and the wounded flesh?" "When she did not sleep deep enough to enter the somnambulistic trance, he missed her. He went instinctively, and in all innocence, to seek her out, with the result, of course, that she woke and was terrified." "Then in their heart of hearts they love?" I asked finally. John Silence smiled his inscrutable smile. "Profoundly," he answered, "and as simply as only primitive souls can love. If only they both come to realize it in their normal waking states, his double will cease these nocturnal excursions. He will be cured and at rest." The words had hardly left his lips when there was a sound of rustling branches on our left, and the very next instant the dense brushwood parted where it was darkest, and out rushed the swift form of an animal at full gallop. The noise of feet was scarcely audible, but in that utter stillness I heard the heavy panting breath and caught the swish of the low brushes against its sides. It went straight towards Joan, and as it went the girl lifted her head and turned to meet it. And the same instant a canoe that had been creeping silently and unobserved round the inner shore of the lagoon emerged from the shadows and defined itself upon the water with a figure at the middle thwart. It was Maloney. It was only afterwards I realized that we were invisible to him as we stood against the dark background of trees. The figures of Joan and the animal he saw plainly, but not Dr. Silence and myself, standing just beyond them. He stood up in the canoe and pointed with his right arm. I saw something gleam in his hand. "Stand aside, Joan girl, you'll get hit!" he shouted, his voice ringing horribly through the deep stillness, and the same instant a pistol shot cracked out with a burst of flame and smoke, and the figure of the animal, with one tremendous leap into the air, fell back in the shadows and disappeared like a shape of night and fog. Instantly then Joan opened her eyes, looked in a dazed fashion about her, and pressing both hands against her heart, fell with a sharp cry into my arms that were just in time to catch her. And an answering cry sounded across the lagoon, thin, wailing, piteous. It came from Sangree's tent. "Fool!" cried Dr. Silence. "You've wounded him!" And before we could move or realize quite what it meant, he was in the canoe and halfway across the lagoon. Some kind of similar abuse came in a torrent from my lips, too, though I cannot remember the actual words, as I cursed the man for his disobedience and tried to make the girl comfortable on the ground. But the clergyman was more practical. He was spreading his coat over her and dashing water on her face. "It's not Joan I've killed at any rate," I heard him mutter as she turned and opened her eyes and smiled faintly up in his face. "I swear the bullet went straight." Joan stared at him. She was still dazed and bewildered, and still imagined herself with the companion of her trance. The strange lucidity of the somnambulist still hung over her brain and mind, though outwardly she appeared troubled and confused. "Where has he gone to? He disappeared so suddenly, crying that he was hurt," she asked, looking at her father, as though she did not recognize him. "And if they've done anything to him, they have done it to me, too, for he is more to me than—" Her words grew vaguer and vaguer as she returned slowly to her normal waking state, and now she stopped altogether, as though suddenly aware that she had been surprised into telling secrets. But all the way back, as we carried her carefully through the trees, the girl smiled and murmured Sangree's name, and asked if he was injured, until it finally became clear to me that the wild soul of the one had called to the wild soul of the other, and in the secret depths of their beings the call had been heard and understood. John Silence was right. In the abyss of her heart, too deep at first for recognition, the girl loved him, and had loved him from the very beginning. Once her normal waking consciousness recognized the fact, they would leap together like twin flames, and his affliction would be at an end. His intense desire would be satisfied. He would be cured. And in Sangree's tent Dr. Silence and I sat up for the remainder of the night. This wonderful and haunted night that had shown us such strange glimpses of a new heaven and a new hell. For the Canadian tossed upon his balsam boughs with high fever in his blood, and upon each cheek a dark and curious contusion showed, throbbing with severe pain, though the skin was not broken, and there was no outward and visible sign of blood. "Maloney shot straight, you see," whispered Dr. Silence to me after the clergyman had gone to his tent, and had put Joan to sleep beside her mother, who, by the way, had never once awakened. "The bullet must have passed clean through the face, for both cheeks are stained. He'll wear these marks all his life, smaller, but always there. They are the most curious scars in the world, these scars transferred by repercussion from an injured double. They'll remain visible until just before his death, and then, with the withdrawal of the subtle body, they will disappear finally." His words mingled in my dazed mind with the sighs of the troubled sleeper and the crying of the wind about the tent. Nothing seemed to paralyze my powers of realization so much as these twin stains of mysterious significance upon the face before me. It was odd, too, how speedily and easily the camp resigned itself again to sleep and quietness, as though a stage curtain had suddenly dropped down upon the action and concealed it. And nothing contributed so vividly to the feeling that I had been a spectator of some kind of visionary drama as the dramatic nature of the change in the girl's attitude. Yet, as a matter of fact, the change had not been so sudden and revolutionary as appeared. Underneath, In those remoter regions of consciousness where the emotions, unknown to their owners, do secretly mature, and owe thence their abrupt revelation to some